The air was thick with the stench of blood and smoke as Dafydd ap Griffith, the last Welsh prince, was dragged to the scaffold. The crowd's murmurs of fear and anger hung heavy in the air. Edward, the King of England, stood tall, his face a mask of cold determination. Dafydd, once a symbol of Welsh pride, was about to face a gruesome death. Hanged as a common criminal, Dafydd's punishment was only beginning. Before he could die, a butcher's blade sliced through his intestines, which were then burned in front of him. His body was chopped into quarters and sent to 4 English cities, while his head was placed on a spike at the Tower of London. There it joined his brothers, the 2 Welsh princes staring lifelessly over the city they had once hoped to rule. Wales, the land they had fought for, was now silenced by the relentless hammering of construction. King Edward I was determined to crush any hope of rebellion with a massive castle-building program. The once proud nation was being reshaped, its landscape scarred by the rise of imposing fortresses. The medieval building sites were chaotic, a mix of noise and dirt. For 7 months each year, from April to November, work on the castles never stopped. The land around the construction sites was transformed, forests were cleared, stones were quarried, and furnaces roared. Streams of carts carried massive logs and timber, and new roads were trampled by countless workers. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and filth, the sounds of hammering and shouting echoing across the landscape. Master James of St. George, the greatest castle builder of his time, was at the heart of this monumental task. He had met King Edward during the king's journey back from the Holy Land, and his skills did not go unnoticed. James came from a family of builders, having learned the art from his father and spent his youth working on castles in the Alps. His expertise in managing large construction sites made him invaluable to the king. In 1278, Edward hired Master James to build a ring of fortresses that would cement English control over Wales. These castles were not just military outposts, they were symbols of Plantagenet power, designed to remind the Welsh of their new status as subjects. Edward and his advisors chose strategic locations and incorporated the best defensive features from other European castles. The first castles to rise were at Flint and Rhuddlan, followed by Aberystwyth and Builth. These were part of the initial settlement after Edward's first invasion. However, during the subsequent rebellion, some of these castles were attacked and damaged, including the half-built structure at Aberystwyth. After the rebellion was crushed, the building program expanded, with new castles commissioned at Denbigh, Harlech, Conwy, and Caernarfon. The most magnificent of all, Beaumaris, began construction on Anglesey in 1295. The castles were designed with concentric walls, towers, and gatehouses, making them nearly impregnable. The most innovative feature was the arrow slit, which allowed defenders to fire out, but made it nearly impossible for attackers to shoot in. Each castle was a blend of military might and artistic sophistication, a testament to the wealth and ambition of the Plantagenet dynasty. Caernarfon Castle, in particular, stood out. Built on the site of an ancient Roman fort, it featured multicolored masonry and octagonal towers, drawing inspiration from the walls of Constantinople. The castle's construction was accompanied by a legend, the supposed discovery of the remains of Magnus Maximus, a Roman emperor linked to Welsh mythology. The remains were exhumed and reburied in the town church, adding a layer of historical and cultural significance to the fortress. Along with the castles, new towns were built to reinforce the English presence. These planned settlements provided homes for English settlers and generated income to offset the cost of construction. Despite the hostility of the conquered locals, many English workers and families were willing to move to Wales, drawn by the promise of a new life. In the spring of 1284, Queen Eleanor, Edward's wife, arrived in Caernarfon. She was pregnant, and on April 25th, she gave birth to a son, named Edward after his father. The birth of Edward of Caernarfon was a powerful symbol of conquest and propaganda. The new prince was a living reminder of the Plantagenet claim to the newly conquered land, a child born in a town rich with ancient British history. The cost of Edward's conquest was immense. The First Welsh War cost around £23,000, while the Second War and the castle building program totaled around £150,000. The castles alone ranged from £14,000 to £20,000 each. To pay for this, Edward imposed a harsh peace on Wales, overhauling the native legal and administrative system. The Statute of Wales, passed in 1284, replaced much of the Welsh legal framework with English law. Counties were established, and English-style sheriffs and courts took control. Welsh princes and their families were stripped of their lands and titles, and loyal English supporters were brought in to enforce the new order. The impact of the conquest was felt not just in Wales, but also in England. The need to raise such vast sums of money forced Edward to implement sweeping reforms. Under the guidance of Robert Burnell, the king's chief advisor, a series of statutes were passed to improve English administration and justice. These reforms addressed issues ranging from land disputes and debt to criminal justice at the local level. The Statute of Winchester, for example, required local communities to take responsibility for law and order, with severe penalties for failing to catch criminals. Commercial roads were cleared to ensure the safe movement of goods and people. Edward's government also worked to streamline royal finances. A recoinage in 1279 restored the value of the currency, and measures were taken to improve bookkeeping and debt collection. Despite these efforts, the king still needed to rely on foreign loans and regular taxes to fund his ambitious projects. The castles rose, the laws were rewritten, and a new prince was born. Wales was forever changed, and the Plantagenet dynasty stood stronger than ever. But the road ahead was long, and the price of conquest was far from paid. In the year 1290, Edward I, the King of England, was determined to leave a lasting legacy. He believed that strong and radical policies were necessary to bind the nation together and support his expensive foreign wars. However, his legacy came with a dark side, particularly in his treatment of England's Jewish population. On a Tuesday, October 10, 1290, a group of poor Jews from London boarded a boat to leave England. They carried royal warrants of safe passage and wore yellow, book-shaped badges to distinguish themselves from Christians. They packed all their belongings, knowing they would never return. As the boat sailed down the Thames, the Jews were leaving behind a city where life had become increasingly difficult. Laws had been passed to restrict their trade, and they faced violence and discrimination. Synagogues were burned, friends were beaten or hanged, and preachers called for their conversion. The boat passed through the countryside and reached the Thames estuary. The captain, a Christian, anchored the boat on a sandbank and told the Jews to stretch their legs. As the tide began to rise, the captain and crew fled, leaving the Jews stranded. The rising tide swept them away, and all of them drowned. This incident, though brutal, was not typical of the generally peaceful Exodus, but it showed the cruelty Jews faced during the 13th century. England's Jewish population, numbering around 2,000, had lived under the king's protection since the time of Edward the Confessor. However, conditions worsened over the years. In 1240, 3 Jews were executed in Norwich for allegedly circumcising a Christian child. In 1255, a Jew named Jopan was accused of murdering a Christian boy, leading to the arrest and execution of many Jews. Henry III restricted Jewish trade in 1269 and made blasphemy a hanging offense. Edward I's Statute of Jewry in 1275 banned most forms of usury, restricted where Jews could live, and imposed a yellow badge. Jews were also heavily taxed and faced frequent accusations of coin clipping, leading to mass arrests and executions. Despite these restrictions, Jews remained a crucial part of England's financial sector. Usury continued, and Jews traded in bonds of debt. This made them unpopular with the landowning classes, who often defaulted on loans. By Edward's reign, there was strong pressure to eliminate Jewish trade. Edward, a Crusader prince, was willing to follow this trend to fill his coffers and gain political support. Edward's financial needs were acute. He had just returned from Gascony, where he had spent heavily on reforms. He owed a significant debt to the Riccardi bankers and needed money to fund a potential crusade. The political atmosphere was tense, with allegations of corruption against his officials. Edward needed to raise funds without causing unrest, so he turned to expelling the Jews. This move would buy him political capital and possibly bring in income from confiscated Jewish property. In July 1290, Edward's nobles and knights agreed to a deal, a tax in exchange for the expulsion of the Jews. The Edict of Expulsion, issued on July 18, 1290, ordered the Jews to leave England by November 1st on pain of death. The Jews began to leave, and by autumn most were gone or dead. The expulsion was a populist move that raised a substantial tax of £116,000, the largest in medieval England. While the landowners were delighted, the ordinary people and the Jews suffered greatly. As the Jews left, it seemed that Edward might embark on another crusade. However, fate had other plans. In September 1290, a fleet from Norway carried a 6-year-old girl named Margaret, the Maid of Norway, to Scotland. Margaret was to become the next Scottish queen, and was betrothed to Edward's young son, Edward of Caernarfon. This marriage was meant to secure peace, and a dynastic union between England and Scotland. However, Margaret's death in 1290 left Scotland without an heir, plunging the kingdom into crisis. Between 1286 and 1290, Scotland was ruled by a council of guardians. The death of Alexander III and the failure of his line left the country in turmoil. The council chose Margaret as the heir, and the Treaty of Berghem in 1290 confirmed her marriage to Edward of Caernarfon, ensuring that Scotland would remain separate and free from English subjection. But the death of the Maid of Norway changed everything, setting the stage for future conflicts, including the Scottish Wars of Independence. As the year 1290 came to a close, Edward's focus shifted from the Crusades to the growing tensions at home. The expulsion of the Jews and the Scottish crisis marked the beginning of a new chapter in his reign, one characterized by internal and external conflicts. Margaret's journey from Norway to Scotland was just a regular trip in those days. Norway and Scotland were close, connected by regular trade routes across the North Sea. The Orkney Islands, a group of islands off the coast of Scotland, served as a stopping point. The Earls of Orkney owed loyalty to both the Scottish and Norwegian kings, making it a perfect midway spot. By early September 1290, Margaret was on her way, and by the third week she had landed in Orkney. News of her arrival spread quickly through Scottish and English diplomatic circles. English diplomats, led by Bishop Anthony Beck of Durham, were sent to Scotland with valuable gifts for the young princess. However, they never got the chance to present these gifts. In late September, tragic news reached Scotland. Margaret had died on Orkney after a week of illness, likely due to food poisoning from spoiled food during her voyage. Margaret's death was a significant blow because it meant the end of the Dunkeld line, which had ruled Scotland for nearly 3 centuries. Scotland was now without a king, and the country was on the brink of chaos. Letters and messages flew between Edward's court and the Scottish nobles, who were arming themselves and preparing for a power struggle. The Bishop of St. Andrews wrote to Edward, urging him to come to the Scottish border to help prevent a civil war. Only someone with Edward's authority could help restore order and choose a new king. While dealing with this crisis, Edward received news that his wife, Queen Eleanor, was gravely ill. She had been traveling to meet him in Lincoln when she fell ill in Harby, Nottinghamshire, on November 28, 1290. Edward rushed to her side and she passed away. Eleanor was 49, and the couple had been married for 36 years, with 16 children. Edward mourned deeply, saying he could not cease to love her. As her body was brought back to Westminster, Edward ordered the construction of large stone crosses at each place where her body lay. These Eleanor crosses were a public display of his grief, inspired by the crosses built for Louis IX of France. Edward also sponsored thousands of masses to help her soul in the afterlife. Meanwhile, the great cause began in Scotland, a complex legal case to determine the next king. 13 different claimants vied for the throne, but the main contenders were John Balliol and Robert Bruce. Edward saw this as an opportunity to strengthen his influence over Scotland. He believed in the feudal rights of the English crown over Scotland and wanted to assert his authority. The legal process was lengthy and complicated. The claimants eventually agreed to submit to Edward's judgment, recognizing his overlordship. This decision was not easy, and it took a year of negotiations before a conference at Norham Castle on the border confirmed Edward's role. By November 1292, the case was settled, and John Balliol was crowned King of Scotland at Scone. However, Balliol soon realized that his kingship was not what he had hoped. Edward had overseen the election of a vassal, not an equal. Balliol had to swear fealty to Edward, promising loyalty and obedience. Edward also claimed the right to hear appeals against Balliol's decisions, which contradicted the Treaty of Berghem, which promised to preserve Scottish rights and laws. When Balliol protested, Edward threatened him, and Balliol backed down, renewing his homage. This humiliation weakened Balliol's position and made his kingship appear hollow. Edward's actions, however, were backfiring. By trying to exert too much control, he pushed the Scots into opposition and drove them closer to the French. The situation in Scotland was becoming increasingly tense, and Edward's overreach was only making things worse. At the same time, a trade war was brewing in the English Channel and along the Atlantic coast. Merchant ships from England, Normandy, Flanders, Gascony, and Castile were engaging in skirmishes and pirate raids. The conflict escalated, and Edward tried to negotiate peace with Philip IV of France. Philip, known as La Belle the Fair, was a young but ruthless king who had a history of persecuting groups that opposed him. Edward's efforts to appease Philip failed, and the French king demanded that Edward appear before a French court. When Edward refused, the two countries found themselves at war. Edward formed alliances with princes to the north and east of France, planning a direct invasion to defend Gascony. However, his plans were complicated by a massive Welsh rebellion led by Madog ap Llywelyn, a distant relative of the last Welsh prince, Llywelyn the Last. Madog and other Welsh leaders attacked English castles in Wales, forcing Edward to divert troops from the French campaign to quell the rebellion. Edward launched his third invasion of Wales in the winter of 1294, leading a large army from Chester to Conwy. The Welsh rebels managed to capture part of the English baggage train and besieged Edward at Conwy Castle. Despite the challenges, Edward's leadership and the eventual receding of the floods allowed him to break the siege. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but the diversion of resources had severely weakened Edward's ability to mount a successful campaign against France. Edward's ambitions in Scotland and Wales, while successful in the short term, had created new challenges and enemies. The balance of power in the British Isles was shifting, and the future was uncertain. The year 1295 was a turning point for King Edward I. After a harsh winter, spring brought a decisive victory for the English. On March 5th, troops led by the Earl of Warwick defeated the Welsh forces at Mies Moydog. Despite the bravery of the Welsh, they stood no chance against the well-organized English army. After this battle, Edward felt confident enough to tour Wales, mopping up the remaining rebels. By mid-June, Wales was under English control, and the rebel leaders were captured. However, this victory came at a high cost. Edward had spent over £54,000 on the campaign, and another £11,300 on building Beaumaris Castle. This was a huge sum, especially since he had also lost valuable time in his war for Gascony. To make matters worse, in August, French ships attacked the southern coast of England, burning Dover and killing several people. When Edward called a meeting of his nobles at Westminster, many of them refused to support his campaign in Gascony. They argued that it was the king's personal business, not England's. Edward was furious and imposed harsh penalties on those who refused to help. He also ordered the construction of new warships to defend the coast. Panic spread as rumors of a full French invasion began to circulate. A knight named Thomas Turberville was discovered to be a spy for the French, and watchmen were posted along the south coast to look out for the French fleet. In November, Edward called a large assembly of barons, bishops, knights, and town representatives to a parliament. He tried to rally support by promising that no one would have to pay out of pocket for the campaign. He also warned of the danger from France, saying, "The King of France, not satisfied with the treacherous invasion of Gascony, has prepared a mighty fleet and army for the purpose of invading England and wiping the English tongue from the face of the earth." Despite his efforts, the situation in Gascony worsened, and Edward had to turn his attention to a new crisis. John Balliol, the King of Scotland, had been stripped of power by Scottish nobles who formed a council to rule in his place. Edward's attempts to assert his authority in Scotland had only weakened Balliol's position. In February 1296, Scotland and France signed a treaty of friendship, known as the Auld Alliance. This alliance would last for centuries. Edward decided to teach the Scots a lesson. In February 1296, he led his army north. The Scots sent raiding parties into Northumberland, but the English waited until after Easter to attack. Their first target was Berwick-upon-Tweed, a town that had often been disputed between England and Scotland. On March 30th, 1296, the Battle of Berwick began. The English, led by Robert Lord Clifford, massacred the town's inhabitants. Chroniclers estimated that over 11,000 people were killed. The town was then fortified with a large ditch, symbolizing English victory. The English continued their campaign, moving deeper into Scotland. The Scots called the English tailed dogs, but the English had a well-organized war machine. After the defeat at Berwick, John Balliol renounced his homage to Edward. The next major battle was at Dunbar, where the Earl of Surrey led the English to another victory. The Scottish earls and barons were captured and sent to the Tower of London. Edward then publicly humiliated Balliol, stripping him of his coat of arms and sending him to the Tower. He also took the Scottish royal regalia, including the Stone of Destiny, and brought them to London. Edward decided to rule Scotland directly, like he did in Wales. He held a parliament in Berwick, where thousands of Scots swore fealty to him. A new network of English governance was set up in Scotland. However, the Scottish resistance was far from over. In February 1297, Edward called a parliament at Salisbury to prepare for his war against France. He needed money and support, but the mood was against him. The country was tired of Edward's costly wars, and the clergy, led by Robert Winchelsea, refused to pay taxes for the campaign. Edward responded by seizing their property, but this only added to the discontent. At the Parliament, Edward asked the nobles to fight in Gascony, while he led the campaign in northern France. Many nobles, led by Roger Bigod, the Earl of Norfolk, refused. They argued that they were only obligated to serve alongside the king, not separately. This led to mass desertion, and Edward was forced to find a new strategy. Despite the setbacks, Edward was determined to continue his campaign. The crisis in Gascony was urgent, and he needed to act quickly. The year 1297 would be a crucial test of his leadership and the loyalty of his subjects. As Edward I lay ill in Winchester, the kingdom he had fought so hard to build and protect faced new challenges. The old king, once a towering figure of strength and determination, was now a shadow of his former self, transported by litter as his strength waned. The year was 1306, and the news that Robert Bruce had crowned himself King of Scotland in Scone Abbey sent shockwaves through the English court. The Scottish wars, which had seemed to be winding down, were reigniting with a vengeance. Edward I, despite his failing health, was determined to crush this new rebellion and finally bring Scotland under his control. He knew, however, that his time was running out. His eldest surviving son, Edward of Caernarfon, now 16, was thrust into the spotlight. The young prince, a strong and athletic young man, was given new responsibilities. In April 1306, he was granted Gascony, a significant step in preparing him for kingship. At the Festival of Whitsun, he was knighted at Westminster, along with 300 other young men, in a grand ceremony that marked the passing of the torch to a new generation. During the feast, Edward I, in a moment of dramatic Arthurian flair, brought out a pair of golden swans and promised that he would not rest until he had avenged himself on Robert Bruce. He vowed that once he had achieved this, he would lay down his arms in Britain and travel to the Holy Land to fight the infidels. Young Edward, standing beside his father, swore a similar oath, pledging that he would not sleep 2 nights in the same place until the Scots had been defeated. The assembled knights followed suit, swearing their oaths over the golden swans, their resolve firm. But the old king's determination was met with new challenges. Robert Bruce proved to be a formidable foe, and the pursuit of him over the next 2 years was marked by brutal violence and harsh justice. Earls, bishops, and even women were imprisoned and executed in the king's relentless campaign. Yet, despite the ferocity of his efforts, Edward I could not bring Bruce to heel. The Scottish king remained elusive, a thorn in the side of the English crown. Meanwhile, the relationship between Edward I and his son grew increasingly strained. Young Edward's favoring of Piers Gaveston, a young companion who many in the court found disruptive and inappropriate, led to violent arguments between father and son. Edward I, known for his iron will and deep sense of duty, found it increasingly difficult to tolerate his son's behavior. The tension between them cast a shadow over the young prince's preparation for kingship. As the old king's health continued to decline, the weight of the kingdom fell more heavily on young Edward's shoulders. The challenges ahead were daunting. and the legacy of his father's reign hung over him like a heavy mantle. The future of England and the dream of a united Britain under one crown rested on the young prince's ability to rise to the occasion. In the end, Edward I's life was a testament to the power of determination and the complexities of leadership. His reign had been marked by great achievements and bitter struggles, and the legacy he left behind was one of both triumph and unfinished business. As he prepared to pass the torch to his son, the question remained: would Edward of Caernarfon be the king his father had always hoped he would be, or would he falter in the face of the challenges that lay ahead? The answer would shape the destiny of England and Scotland for generations to come.